Good evening and welcome to Dumbarton Oaks. I am Anatole Chikin, Assistant Director of Garden and Landscape Studies, and it's my special pleasure to introduce our tonight's speaker, Denis Ribouillault, who is Associate Professor and Director of the Graduate Program in Early Modern Art History at the University of Montreal in Canada. Denis is not a newcomer to Dumbarton Oaks. He was a summer fellow here in 2003, and in 2007 he participated in the Dumbarton Oaks Symposium, Recent Issues in Italian Garden Studies. The proceedings of the symposium were published as Clio in the Italian Garden, in which Denis' essay on representational strategies and uses of 16th century painted garden views is probably one of the most original and thought-provoking contributions. This was one of the first symposia that, even though the word garden still featured in its title, marked a growing shift in interest among landscape historians from gardens to larger landscape systems. And this is also why Denis is here again today, since his talk brings together his work on early modern cartography and landscape representations and our program's increasing involvement with the study of urban landscapes. Just a few words about Denis' academic background and scholarly accomplishments, although there are so many that I have to be very selective. Denis gained his PhD at the University of Paris Panthéon Sorbonne in 2006. Between 2006 and 2008, he taught at the Courtauld Institute of Art in London. He was then offered Dumbarton Oaks Fellowship for 2008-9, but instead he went to another Harvard Research Institute at the Villa Tati in Florence. And there he joined one of the most prestigious centers of Renaissance scholarship, but opted, as I am absolutely convinced, for a much inferior garden. For, as we all know, Cecil Pinson's garden of the Villa Tati, commissioned by Bernard Berenson, stands no comparison with ours designed by Beatrix Farrand. Before moving to Canada, Denis also had a year-long appointment at the Villa Medici in Rome, the seat of the French Academy. Denis' recent monograph on Roman gardens, published in 2013, sheds important new light on the depictions of landscape in the decoration of 16th century Roman villas as expressions of social identities and political power. He also edited 2 volumes, jointly with Michel Wiman and Hervé Brunon, on sacred landscapes and landscape representations in painting, both published by Olszki in Florence in 2011 and 2016, respectively. And his current work focuses on various concurrent themes, but especially on the development of proto-scientific culture in the gardens of 16th and 17th century Rome, specifically looking at astronomy and sundials, the figure of a landscape draftsman in Renaissance art, and the connections between early modern imagination, cartography, and city views. And the subject of his tonight's talk is Glorifying the City in Counter-Reformation Italy, Girolamo Righettino, Rediscovered. So please join me in welcoming Denis Ribouillault.
Thanks very much for this generous introduction. I'm very sorry that I didn't come to Dumbarton Oaks, and instead I went to Italy. I want to thank John Bertsley, Anatole again, and Jane Paddleford for their warm welcome. It's a delight to be here tonight, and I want to thank all of you to attend this lecture. We'll try to take you back in time as a kind of distraction, and although I'm afraid I will also be talking about politics, election, and so forth, but I'm going to be trying to be as cheerful as it is possible to be. So here we go. On November 25th, 1585, Pope Sixtus V, who had been elected to the throne of St. Peter a few months before, grants an audience to the Venetian canon Girolamo Righettino. As a gift to the Pope, Righettino brings with him a splendid drawing represented the city of Rome within an extraordinarily ornate frame replete with allegorical figures and heraldic emblems. So during this audience, Righettino explains to the Pope every minute details of his work, which, he insists, has been drawn with his left hand. The Pope is thrilled and no doubt flattered by the celebratory nature and the exegetical refinement of the iconographic program of the view, orders the canon to put everything into writing. As a way of thanking him, the Pope conferred upon him the charge of Bishop of Caorle, a small parish town not far from Venice. And Righettino himself, in a manuscript I have discovered, tells us this peculiar story. It is the very manuscript Sixtus V commissioned Righettino after their meeting, 80 pages long, with its beautifully illustrated cover dedicated to Cardinal Rusticucci. This manuscript, today preserved in the Biblioteca Federiciana at Fano in the Italian Marches, offers a complete guide to the allegories and ornaments Righettino had invented to praise the city of Rome and its new custodian, the Pope. And it bears the following title. I'm going to show off with my Italian: Sommario, ovvero dichiarazione degli concetti, the ideas, posti per ornamento della città di Roma, fatta appena et consacrata al Santissimo et Beatissimo Padre Signor nostro, Sixto V, da Girolamo Righettino, veneziano, canonico regolare lateranense, per allegrezza della sua nuova esaltazione. Unfortunately, Righettino's view of Rome is probably lost, or perhaps hidden in some obscure archive or private collection. But this episode is in itself fascinating if one recalls the great urban plans that were to be realized during the reign of Sixtus V, and that still shape today every visitor's experience of the urban landscape of Rome. Obelisks, columns, palaces and facades built during his short 5-year rule transformed the city dramatically, uniting key Christian sites of the city into what Ludwig van Pastor called a single holy shrine. Sistine Rome became a sacred space, the sign of the triumph of Christianity and the very emblem of the good government of the Pope, the Vicar of Christ on earth. This is the fountain of Moses, of course. Yet in November 1585, none of these magnanime imprese, these grandiose enterprises, had been even started. None of the numerous fresco decorations celebrating the Pope's good government of the city had been realized. So we can ask the following question. At so early a date in this pontificate, what role might have played the drawing of this obscure Venetian in shaping the Pope's plans, the Pope's ideas? Was his combination of a realistic city portrait with a complex emblematic program unique in Counter-Reformation Italy? What does this peculiar visual language tell us about contemporary conceptions of the urban landscape? And first question of all, who was Girolamo Righettino? Today, Righettino has been completely forgotten. The most recent source I have found on the character dates from 1649. In the Venice archive, we have found rather uninteresting information regarding his administration of the Diocese of Caorle when he became a bishop, but nothing concerning his artistic activity. A few precious documents, however, shed some light on his unusual career. The first one is the one that first triggered my interest and convinced me a couple of years ago to look more deeply into this topic. Tommaso Garzoni, in a book now famous to Renaissance historians, published in 1585, La piazza di tutte le professioni del mondo, mentions Righettino in the chapter dedicated to choreography. During the Renaissance, chorography is the art of describing or mapping a region or place, like a city, and by extension, such a description, map, or view. The term chorographia derives from Ptolemy's geography, who distinguishes it from geography as the study and representation of the entire world. And Garzoni, in these texts, states that Righettino became famous for his city views, and compares him with the most famous geographers of his time, Gerard Mercator and Abraham Ortelius. He also mentions the view of Rome given to Sixtus V, as well as other views also presented as gifts to powerful Italian princes. A view of the Tremiti Islands given to Duke Francesco de' Medici in 1581, and a view of Turin presented in 1583 to the Duke Charles Emmanuel of Savoy, for which he received a splendid reward. And this view is the only extant work by Righettino's hand still preserved today, or at least the only one that I could retrace. Signed and dated 1583 and measuring 68 by 94 centimeters, this pen and ink drawing on vellum is now preserved at the National Archives in Turin. Here I show you a photograph of the work in situ with the head of the archive, Luisa Gentile, to give you a sense of its size. This drawing is incredibly detailed, beautifully executed, and unique in its genre. Amazingly, it has never been studied, and the only modern literature on this piece consists of a few very brief and broad descriptions in local catalogues. Now, the description of the view of Rome in the Fano manuscript I have recovered corresponds closely, although not entirely, to the general configuration and to the emblematic figures visible on the view of Turin, so that it is now possible to study this exceptional work for the first time with its author as our guide. But before we do this, some additional information on Righettino's career can prove useful. In 1649, the Lateran canon Celso Rossino dedicated an imposing volume to famous and important members of his religious order, providing crucial information on Righettino. Righettino was a member of the Augustinian order of the Lateran canons and was attached to the Venetian convent of Santa Maria della Carità. If you know Venice, go to Galleria dell'Accademia. This is where the convent was. Unlike many of his very erudite colleagues in the order, he did not become a preacher. Rather, he was an expert in casuistry. So casuistry was then the science of resolving problems of moral choice, which were known as cases of conscience. This science has recently been recognized as a crucial element of Renaissance political discourse. To quote Michael Hörnqvist, it involves a process of generalization, abstraction, and simplification, through which a leading case and a general model of action is created, under which individual cases can be subsumed. It is intended to mediate between the realm of universal principles and the practical sphere of human action, to communicate between the universals above and the political and human realities below. End of quote. Interestingly, we will observe some of these processes in Righettino's visual works. Rossino, in his biography, also tells us that in Venice, Righettino became a real oracle, and his advice was much sought after on the subject of moral and political matters. Several Venetian senators held him in very high esteem. Rossino recounts that ambassadors asked him to accompany them on their diplomatic missions to Constantinople, Rome, Vienna, or Paris. Righettino was particularly close to two very important characters in the diplomatic world of the Italian Renaissance. The first is Lorenzo Priuli, a Venetian nobleman who was ambassador to the ducal court of Tuscany, to Philip II in Madrid, to the court of Henry III in France, and finally to the papal see at Rome during the last months of Gregory XIII's pontificate and the first month after Sixtus V's election. And Priuli ended his illustrious career with a nomination in 1590 as Patriarch of Venice, a testimony to the very close links he had developed with the Roman Church. Another character close to Righettino was also a key player in the geopolitical arena, Marcantonio Barbaro. Barbaro made his career in the same diplomatic circles. He was ambassador to France, to the Pope, and most importantly was stationed as the Venetian ambassador to Constantinople during the very difficult years that led to the Battle of Lepanto. He filled many important positions in the Venetian Republic and was made one of the procurators of St. Mark, the highest office of state below that of the Doge. Not long ago, Deborah Howard published an important book on his patronage of architecture and his close friendship with Andrea Palladio. Righettino obviously belonged to the same intellectual circles. For instance, in 1586, he dedicated to Marcantonio Barbaro a treatise on mystical numerology, De Numerorum Sophia Algebraica ac Mystica, a book that, again, unfortunately, I was unable to retrace, but that gives us a bit of an insight into his intellectual formation. Marcantonio and his brother Daniele were also patrons of the convent where he lived, Santa Maria della Carità, which had been reconstructed in an all'antica style by Andrea Palladio, with the support of the powerful Barbaro brothers, leading members of the pro-papal Vecchio faction in Venice. So the proximity of this Righettino with these key political characters shed some light on the possible function that his city views played as diplomatic gifts. When Righettino presented his view to the new Pope Sixtus V, his friend Lorenzo Priuli was the ambassador, and Marcantonio Barbaro headed at the very time an important Venetian delegation with the aim of consolidating the relationship between Venice and the new papacy. During this very occasion, Francesco Barbaro, Marcantonio's son, was appointed by the Pope new Patriarch of Aquileia. These circumstances, and above all the highly encomiastic, celebratory nature of Righettino's gift, seem to indicate that he played a role within these political transactions. To be sure, his nomination as a bishop, albeit of a small and poor parish, appears slightly disproportionate, and is more reasonably explained by his acquaintances with the Priuli and Barbaro families and his contribution to a new fruitful association between Venice and Rome. Now, Righettino's gift of the Turin drawing to the Duke Charles Emmanuel of Savoy can also be considered a diplomatic gift. After having accompanied his father to Constantinople and before being appointed Patriarch of Aquileia, Francesco Barbaro was, until 1581, the Venetian ambassador to the Savoy court. He was a privileged witness to the extraordinary development of the Duchy of Savoy under the rule of Charles Emmanuel's father, Emmanuel Philibert, and he wrote a very important relazione, a report, to the Venetian state in 1581 about the accomplishments of Emanuele Filiberto and the new Duke Charles Emmanuel. At the beginning of Charles Emmanuel's reign, cultural, artistic, and diplomatic contacts with Venice were flourishing, and many artistic and urban projects were conceived to make the new capital, Turin, a city equal in splendor to the greatest European cities. So we're very much here in a climate of competition. For instance, the young Duke commissioned two vast pictures from Paolo Veronese. In the meeting between Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, dated 1582, the Duke is depicted under the guise of King Solomon, whilst it can be argued that the Queen of Sheba, presenting her gifts to the king, represents Venice itself, congratulating the new ruler upon his coronation. According to the Veronese expert Richard Koch, the Venetian ambassador Francesco Barbaro is the likely author of the iconographic program of the painting and his portrait to the left of the monarch. So this iconography of gift giving can be compared to an interesting detail situated in the left-hand corner of Righettino views of Turin. The Duke is represented on his throne under a baldachin and is being presented a gift by what appears at first sight to be a child. Yet it is not a child, because you can see here he wears adult clothing. It is probably a self-portrait of Righettino, who, as Rosino recalls in his biography, was very small, and for this reason became known as the small Righetto, Righettino. Furthermore, the scene here is connected with a representation in a medallion of the Lion of St. Mark, the Doge's hat, and a cartouche bearing the inscription Charles Emmanuel of Savoy, son of the Venetian Republic. So this diplomatic reverence is also expressed in the Fano manuscript, where Righettino compares his voyage to see the newly elected Pope Sixtus V to that of the biblical Magi, who brought gifts to the newly born Christ, an iconography often linked to diplomatic context during the Italian Renaissance, like that of the meeting between Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Righettino is thus a peculiar character in the artistic world of the Renaissance. He remains an amateur draftsman, and his work should not be understood through the tradition of the Venetian bottega, but rather in the context of the religious life of a convent. His city views possess a crucial spiritual dimension, not only because of the minuteness and meticulousness of his drawings, which can be considered a form of prayer, but also because of the symbolic and geometric dimension he gives to them. In this respect, he is heir to the great tradition of late medieval cartography, produced within monasteries, and of which Fra Mauro's famous world map, preserved at the Biblioteca Marciana in Venice, is one of the most beautiful and meaningful examples. This devotional quality of his draftsmanship is also emphasized by Righettino himself. He recounts that Sixtus V marveled literally at the fact that he had drawn this credible drawing with his left hand, considering that this was clearly a manifestation of divine will. One thing that must be understood about Righettino is that he was no cosmographer, no geographer like Fra Mauro, for example. The comparison with Ortelius or Mercator made by Tommaso Garzoni, which I mentioned earlier, is widely exaggerated, and it makes sense only when one realizes that Garzoni was one of Righettino's pals. Well, he was one of his closest colleagues in the same order. This is why. In truth, Righettino had no skill at surveying, and for his city views, he did what many artists then used to do. He selected the most recent prints available on the market and copied them faithfully. His view of Turin is taken from Giovanni Caraca's 1572 view of the city, engraved by Johannes Krieger in 1577 and inserted in the Augusta Taurinorum, the history of Piedmont, written by the great humanist Emanuele Filiberto Pingone. Another example, earlier on, Righettino probably used the engraving by Natale Bonifacio, published in Venice in 1574, for his drawing of the Trinity Islands, a property of his order and an important outpost in the Mediterranean. A final example for the view of Ginevra, contained within the Turin drawing, he used the 1567 view of the city by Paolo Forlani and Bolognino Zaltieri, again produced in Venice. And he had a big supply of city views. You know that Venice was the most important center for the production of city views at the end of the 16th century. In short, what is most interesting with Righettino's works is how he inserts the image of the city within a larger decorative and symbolic frame. He gives visual access to the urban space, yet at the same time he isolates it from its larger natural landscape. The city space is now located in an abstract and geometrical frame, an ideal order. The square inside a circle, as you know, is one of the most universal symbols of the conjunction between heaven and earth. The circle referring to the perfection of creation and to the Creator as all-knowing and all-seeing. Here I show you, among many, many different images, an image in one of the Renaissance earliest geographical atlas with the creation of the world, Hartmann Scheddel's Nuremberg Chronicles from 1493. Righettino's perspectival view seen from above and the miniature-like quality of his drawing evoke the idea of visio Dei, the eye of God, an omnipotent vision of the world, both material and spiritual. Thus, the image of the city oscillates between two visual modes that complement each other, topography and allegory. At the same time, it is a vision of the city and an allegory of princely power, of good government, of celestial sovereignty. In this respect, Righettino's views belong to a long tradition of cartographic and urban images whose primary function was to assert religious and historical truths through the use of allegorical and symbolic figures rather than through the registration of a geographical reality. I believe one can usefully compare his views to the famous frescoes by Ambrogio Lorenzetti of the good and bad government in the Palazzo Pubblico at Siena. In both cases, we find allegories of virtues necessary for the good government of the territory and the city. The central presence also of the allegories of peace and war. The dialectical relationship between città and contado, between city and country. And finally, the cosmic symbols that give unity to the whole scheme. Like Righettino, Ambrogio Lorenzetti brought out the cosmic congruity of human life with the order of the heavens. And another remark can also apply, I believe, to Righettino's city views. It is a mistake to regard Lorenzetti's fresco as purely mimetic. Hans Belting has cautioned us that Lorenzetti, quote, intended first to describe an ideal city and then make sure that this ideal city was Siena. And I think this, for me, summarizes also well Righettino's City Views project. From a formal point of view, comparing Righettino's drawings with the decoration of a great city hall is not as far-fetched as it initially seems. Actually, Righettino's unique composition recalls contemporary ceiling decorations, and especially those of the Ducal Palace in Venice. In 1577, a fire destroyed the two main rooms of the palace. This is the Sala del Senato, and this is the Sala del Gran Consiglio, in a beautiful painting by Francesco Guardi. Plans for rebuilding were immediately put into place. Cristoforo Sorte, a painter and an architect, but also an important cartographer, supervised the works for the new decoration and provided the drawings for the ornamental frames for the two ceilings of the Sala del Senato and the Sala del Gran Consiglio. And interestingly, he also realized great maps of the Venetian terraferma, the Venetian territory, that were to be hanged on the walls of the Sala del Senato and dialogued with the allegorical program developed on the ceiling. A drawing dated 1578 is preserved at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London and bears a great resemblance with Righettino's ornamental style. Not surprisingly, one of Cristoforo Sorte's main patrons at the time was Marcantonio Barbaro. So again, we are here within quite a restricted, in fact, circle of people. And Marcantonio Barbaro was a member of the commission in charge of the restoration of the palace. According to the epideictic, the rhetorical tradition that defines choreography during the Renaissance, the views of Turin and Rome were praises to those cities and their rulers. The image of the city here is clearly identified with princely power. In the four corners of the Turin drawing, there are four ideal portraits of the Duke, located in correspondence with medallions referring here to Pope Gregory XIII. You recognize the dragon, the heraldic animal of Gregory XIII, Boncompagni. Here to the King Henry III of France with the double crown of the Kingdom of France and the Kingdom of Poland. Venice, and I've already talked about this small detail, and in the fourth corner, the Order of the Lateran Canons, to which belonged Girolamo Righettino, and his signature is right here. So Righettino here somehow draws a program of international alliances, political alliances. The inscriptions claim that the Duke is not only an ally of Venice, but also a Christian knight at the service of the Church and of Christendom. And indeed, this is a very important aspect of the drawing. It has a strong military dimension, with its many trophies, arms, shields, prisoners, and so forth. In the Fano manuscript, Righettino is very explicit on this point. The virtuous Christian prince has the obligation to exterminate his enemies, namely Turks and heretics. This idea of defense, this military might, is further expressed by the image of the city itself, which showcase its mighty walls and the new citadel, a masterpiece of Renaissance military architecture. Designed by the architect Francesco Pacciotto and finished in 1577, it was the first of a number of pentagonal citadels built in Europe. Abstracted from its landscape, the squared, walled city, with its doors and streets geometrically laid, calls to mind the image of the heavenly Jerusalem. Indeed, the entire city seems to be suspended in heaven. The figures of the winds also enter within such cosmic scheme, as they are generally associated with world maps rather than city views. Here I show you a late 15th century Ptolemaic map of the world with the different winds. Righettino may also have known Jacopo de Barbari's great view of Venice, dated 1500, which is, to my knowledge, one of the few urban images surrounded by allegories of the winds. Like Jacopo de Barbari, Righettino also used mythological figures of Roman gods to qualify the various environments of his urban landscape, Mercury and Neptune, and also to symbolize the elements. So we have Ceres and Bacchus for the territory, for the land, standing for the element earth, Neptune and Aeolus, god of the wind, standing for the seas and the element of water, Jupiter and Juno for the heavens and the element air, and finally Vulcan for the underworld and the element of fire. This link between the city and paradise is very explicitly developed by Righettino in the Fano manuscript. He clearly identifies the image of the city with paradise. Io ho disegnato detto luogo, cioè il paradiso, nella prospettiva di sopra, in mezzo a quelle nubi che circondano la città. According to him, thanks to the good government of the prince, the inhabitants of the city can and will have access to paradise. Here the image of the city represents both the actual city and the promised paradisiacal city of the afterlife. And this idea will be of great importance, as you know, for Sixtus V. For instance, above the great view of Rome in the Salone Sistino in the Vatican, an inscription reads, I quote, "As he opens straight roads towards sacred temples, Sixtus opens for himself a road towards the stars," an allusion to the star of the Virgin Mary of Santa Maria Maggiore, the Stella Mattutina, but also to the arms, his own heraldic emblems, where the star appear, but finally also to the stellar configuration of his urban plan, which is well rendered in this 1588-1589 view. So this idea of the city as a ladder towards paradise is further extolled through the inscription placed above the bull of Turin. Here is literally a pun, a Torino, Turin, literally. It took me actually a long time. I looked in much more complicated ways before it jumped at me and said, Torino, of course. The inscription, however, were a bit more cryptic. Finally, I found it in Petrarch's Triumph of Eternity, che conturba et acquieta gli elementi, who quiets or perturbs the elements. An image here that conjures up an image of God as master of time and of the universe. Petrarch's verse also explains the presence in the drawing on the horizontal axis of the allegories of peace here and war to the right, which are the only two allegories that are clearly identified in the drawing. In a manuscript, Righettino explains that they refer to the capacity of the prince to be ready for either peace or war. And then there's about 10 pages of development, but I'm not going to go into further details. The natural elements are central in Righettino's drawing and in Petrarch's great poem. We find 5 circles corresponding to the 4 elements plus the heavens surrounding the ideal city of Turin. This configuration recalls many medieval cosmological images, with the fundamental difference that the order of the elements is inverted here. Whereas the external band of the circles represent the sky in traditional representation of the cosmos, with Earth in the center, in Righettino's drawing, the external band is dedicated to the representation of the ducal territory, whilst the image of Turin occupies the center, the highest degree in the cosmic hierarchy, in a true apotheosis of the city. Let us look more closely at this external band, highly original. Righettino has represented most of the ducal territory and its cities, yet some of the places depicted were desired, not real possessions. For instance, the city of Geneva or certain Mediterranean islands on which the Duke claimed sovereignty. Again, it's very much a kind of a political manifesto. The representation of Cyprus, for instance, with the citadel, the Venetian citadel of Nicosia, taken by the Turks in 1571, is explained by the fact that Charles Emmanuel bore the title of King of Cyprus and ambitioned to take the island back. In 1594, he had a treatise published with the title Trattato delle ragioni sopra il regno di Cipro appartenenti alla Serenissima Casa di Savoia. Likewise, the inscription around the view of Rhodes, an Ottoman possession since 1522, recalls the motto of the Supreme Order of the Most Holy Annunciation and House of Savoy, FERT, Fortitudo eius Rhodum tenuit, which can be translated as his strength conquered Rhodes. Created in 1362 by Amadeus VI, it celebrated the defense of Rhodes against the Turks by his predecessor, Amadeus V, in 1315. And the medallion of the order, that is the scene of the Annunciation, is shown between the legs of the allegory of Charity, who holds the ducal arms. The third circle represents the element of air, with swans carrying inscriptions with the imperial name Carolus. Then the fourth circle stands for fire, hence the presence of the salamander, associated with this element in classical, medieval, and Renaissance lore. And finally, according to Righettino, the clouds signify paradise. The allegories chosen by Righettino correspond to the famous classical virtues that appear in a large number of Renaissance cycles. You know these ones, the theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity. In the upper part, then, around the ducal arms. And the cardinal or moral virtues, prudence, temperance, fortitude, and justice. Righettino gives great prominence to four speculative virtues that are much less often depicted in Renaissance art, and these constitute a very original and very interesting aspect of his work. We find divine theology here, natural philosophy, and on the other side, metaphysics and mathematics. To give you a sense, Righettino in the Fano manuscripts spends about 20 pages describing in very, very detail every object, the position of the face, of the gaze, and gives symbolic exegetical significance to every little tiny details. So I cannot summarize this to you, but I guess if you have to remember something, it's the work of a theologian, obviously. And for an art historian, it's very nice because we always sometimes accused of being over-interpreting when looking at images. I tell you, reading Righettino is great because you feel, well, they did interpret in ways that we have no idea. And in this regard, is a very interesting document. So these allegories can be described as translation of some of the major principles developed by Aristotle in his physics and metaphysics. And Righettino very often quotes in his guide of the view of Rome specific passages of Aristotle. Also, Righettino seems to insist on the necessary link between good education and good government, a central theme in Renaissance humanism from Erasmus to Baldassare Castiglione. The importance given to mathematics, to natural philosophy, to science, must be understood in the context of Righettino's Venetian culture and Paduan education. Interest that was shared with the members of the Barbaro family and linked to a larger cosmological and philosophical vision of the world, expressed in Palladio's architecture, in the fresco decoration of the family villa at Mazere by Paolo Veronese, or in the extraordinary project of the citadel of Palmanova, placed under the supervision of Marcantonio Barbaro. Righettino's cities of paper and this extraordinary project of new city are the products of the same culture. They have loads in common. At the heart of their program is the triumph of Christianity. They share a mathematical ideal as a utopian construct, a humanistic concern for an ordered society, the necessity of territorial integrity, and the fear of Ottoman expansion. Beside heraldic, topographical, allegorical language, Righettino also used emblems in his drawing. In the lower part, a medallion shows several cypress trees, a symbol of equality, with a much smaller one here. The accompanying motto, Nec minima despicit, do not despise the small, refers here to the ambition of Charles Emmanuel to make his state as significant as other great European powers, and must be understood in the context of the debates over aristocratic precedents that agitated early modern Italy. I conclude. Righettino's city views are unique in their combination of various elements. Belonging to the art of the court and the culture of diplomacy, these images paint the portrait of the virtues of princes who, like Charles Emmanuel of Savoy, Sixtus V, associated in an unprecedented way the image of the city with that of the state, and beyond with the image of paradise itself. Righettino obviously was a fine panegyrist, but he was first of all a theologian and a militant Christian, and a pretty good draftsman. You can concede that to him. His works are heirs to the Principum Specula, the mirrors for princes of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and reveal a desire to convince Christian princes to join their forces to defend the Respublica Cristiana, threatened by European schism and Turkish attacks in the Mediterranean. So I hope this lecture come to a close, and I hope it has given you a small sense of the richness of this work. And yet, I must repeat it, I have barely described it to you. It's so full of details, and when you read the manuscript of Righettino, his explanations are so long, so complex, so philosophically complex, that it is impossible to summarize neatly. For this reason, I am now working with two colleagues specialized in digital art history. My colleague Emmanuel Chateau-Dutier from University of Montreal, and Johanna Cazenave, who works in digital technology applied to historical science at the École Nationale des Chartes in Paris. And we are developing basically a project of digital publication. So using two different tools. One is called the Text Encoding Initiative. That is in order to work on the text and basically do all sorts of very funny and interesting things with the manuscript, with the text, with Righettino and all the other associated sources. And for the image, we use these SVG thing, which is called scalable vector graphics. you can learn all about it on Wikipedia. Obviously, I'm not the technical member of the team. So with these tools that are basically new tools for art historians, we're working on the digital exhibition of Righettino and his view of Turin. And why? Basically because a classical publication in a book format would considerably impoverish the visual and exegetical experience of this fascinating work. Thank you very much.